A man stands on the top step of a carved limestone pool in 1st century Jerusalem, pulling a rough linen tunic over his head. We assume it was a spontaneous Christian invention. But if you look closer at the architecture of these ancient stone pools, the boundary between life and death devolved into a bureaucratic checklist maintained by the priesthood. The wildness of the water was domesticated, trapped in carefully regulated basement pools in the wealthy neighborhoods of the upper city. And then, a man wearing camel's hair walks out of the wilderness. But before we follow that wild prophet into the mud of the Jordan River, we have to look at what we have done to the water. If you walk into a typical church sanctuary today, you will likely find a fiberglass tub built into a stage. It is filled with lukewarm tap water. The lighting is fluorescent. The floors are dry and carpeted. A polite crowd applauds while someone is dipped backward for 3 seconds, smiling for a camera, before wrapping themselves in a warm towel. We have sanitized the deep. If you grew up in a modern religious culture, you were probably taught that baptism is merely an outward sign of an inward grace. You were told it is a public declaration, a spiritual milestone you cross when you feel ready to show the world what has already happened inside your heart. But when you strip the physical terror of the grave away from the water, you neuter the psychological power of the event. If the pool is not an abyss, you are not actually dying to anything. The water is not a sponge bath. It is an execution, at the Levitical codes governing life and death. At the Hebrew language itself, you start to see something the standard reading completely misses. The ancient Judean mind could not process a faith that was only internal. The heavy weight of the physical transition was the entire point. If you are in a season where your faith feels entirely theoretical, where you have prayed the right prayers but the old fears and the old habits refuse to stay dead, it might be because you have lost the muscle memory of the descent. We treat grace as a purely mental exercise. We sit in cushioned chairs and try to simply think our way into a new life. But the 1st century believer knew you could not just decide you were clean. Your body had to feel the cold shock of the deep. Your lungs had to register the momentary panic of being submerged. You had to physically enact the death of the old self before you could legally and spiritually claim the life of the new one. The shadow of the grave had to be washed away by the wildness of the living water. When we lose the theology of the ancient mikveh, we lose the gravity of the transformation. We forget what it costs to cross the boundary. And this brings us back to the man standing in the wilderness. Because when John began pulling people under the surface, he was not inviting them to a polite public declaration. Baptism is not a new ritual John introduced to the world. It is an ancient vocabulary the world had forgotten how to read. He was deliberately hijacking the sacred architecture of the religious elite. And he was doing it in a river that carried a very specific, very violent history. A man stands in the mud. The current pulls at his knees. The Jordan River is not clear. It is brown. It is turbulent. It is wild. John the Baptist does not build a stone pool. He does not ask the priests for permission. He bypasses the temple architecture entirely. He goes to the lowest elevation on earth. The Jordan is a boundary line. It is the exact river Joshua crossed centuries earlier. A generation of slaves walked through its dry bed to enter the promised land. Now, John stands in the exact same water. He is forcing a reset. He is telling a corrupted nation they have to start over. The crowds come. The soldiers come. The tax collectors come. They strip off their garments. They confess their failures. They go under the rushing surface. They emerge shivering in the wind. Then, the pattern violently breaks. Jesus of Nazareth walks down the muddy bank. He takes off his sandals. He steps into the cold current. John freezes. The prophet knows the Levitical code. He knows how the mikveh works. The stone pools are for the impure. The water is for the contaminated. Jesus carries no shadow of the grave. He has no tumah to wash away. So, why go under? For a 1st century Judean, stepping into a mikveh was never about physical hygiene. You actually had to wash yourself thoroughly before you went in. Jesus is not stepping into the Jordan to repent. He is stepping in to declare war. Every person before Jesus went into the mikveh to leave their impurity behind. The water absorbed their death. But Jesus is the author of life. He is absolute, uncorrupted Tahara. When absolute life steps into the realm of death, the dynamic reverses. The water does not cleanse him. He cleanses the water. He goes down into the grave of the deep. He infects it with resurrection. The descent is not an admission of guilt. It is an invasion. He is claiming the abyss as his own territory. He is preparing the water for everyone who will follow him. When he breaks the surface, the sky tears open. The Spirit descends. The voice of the Father thunders over the rushing river. The chaos of Genesis 1 is reversed. A new creation begins right there in the mud. The grave has become a womb. But this cosmic invasion creates a massive legal reality. If the water is truly an execution, what actually happens to the old self you leave at the bottom of the river? To understand the sheer permanence of what happens when you go under, you have to read the letters of a former Pharisee. A few decades after the mud of the Jordan River settles, a former Pharisee named Paul sits down to write a letter. You could not have a single barrier, not a knotted hair, not a speck of mud, not a piece of clothing, not even a ring on your finger between, to the believers living in the capital of the Roman Empire. Paul understands the ancient theology of the Mikveh. He knows the carved stone pools of Jerusalem. He knows the Levitical codes of purity and the heavy shadow of the grave. But he is writing to people living under the brutal, bureaucratic machinery of Rome. So he takes the ancient Jewish water and applies a razor-sharp Roman legal argument to it. In the Roman world, if you are a slave, your master owns your body, your labor, and your future. If you owe a financial debt, the ink on the imperial ledger binds you. The heavy iron chain of your obligations follows you everywhere you go. There is only one event in the human experience that instantly cancels every contract, breaks every chain, and wipes every ledger completely clean. Death. You cannot collect a tax from a tomb. You cannot command a corpse. Death is the ultimate severance of jurisdiction. And Paul drops this staggering legal reality into the 6th chapter of his letter to the Romans. Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? He does not call it a washing. He calls it a funeral. We were therefore buried with him through baptism into death. Your skin and the water. You had to go into the pool exactly as you came out of the womb. Utterly bare, utterly vulnerable. The water is not a promise to try harder next time. It is a legal execution. When you step into the deep, you are not just getting wet. You are agreeing to let the old version of yourself, the one chained to addiction, the one weighed down by anxiety, the one carrying the invisible residue of failure, actually drown. You hold your breath. The cold water fills your ears. The darkness closes over your face. In the eyes of the cosmos, the person who walked down those stone steps has legally ceased to exist. The jurisdiction of your past is permanently shattered. The master of your old life reaches down to grab your collar, and his hand passes through empty water. You owe the darkness absolutely nothing, because the version of you that signed those contracts is dead at the bottom of the deep. But a legal execution is only half the theological equation. A grave is just a grave if the story ends in the dark. And the terrifying beauty of the water is that nobody is meant to stay at the bottom of the pool. The Spirit hovered over the formless deep, and the chaos was pushed back to make room for life. The rain fell until the mountains vanished, and a new humanity stepped off the ark onto dry land. The water is not a bath. It is a grave. The question is why? Why did an entire civilization center its approach to God? A nation of slaves walked into the walled ocean, and an empire drowned while they breathed free air. A prophet was hurled into the raging abyss, and the belly of death spat him back onto the shore. A daughter washed the shadow of the grave off her skin, and she walked clean into the presence of God. A wild preacher called a corrupted nation into a muddy river, and they left their failures in the current. The author of life stepped down into the waters of death, and the grave was forever turned into a womb. Same water, same God. But maybe the part that stays with me most is the architecture of the rain. The ancient rabbis knew that a stagnant pool in a dark Judean basement could never wash away the shadow of the grave on its own. It had to be kissed by the wildness of the sky. It had to be touched by Mayim, Chayim, living water, that no human hands had drawn. You could not manufacture your own purity with hard work. You could not dig a hole and fill it with buckets of your own effort. You could only position yourself in the path of the storm. If you are in a season where you are exhausted from trying to scrub, around the act of climbing down into dark, cold water, and why did Jesus choose this exact ancient mechanism to inaugurate his own public movement? To your own soul clean, if you are carrying the invisible residue of grief, or failure, or a past you cannot seem to outrun, stop trying to haul buckets of drawn water. The mikveh is not asking you to perform. It is asking you to surrender. You do not have to fight the deep. You just have to let the old version of yourself sink. And trust that the one who owns the breath in your lungs will pull you back to the surface. Your failures do not survive the descent. Your past does not have the lungs to breathe underwater. And may the God who has never once abandoned his people to the abyss walk with you into the dark water and bring you out breathing the air of a brand new creation. The answer changes how you read every single time a person touches water in the biblical text. But to feel the weight of what is actually happening in the Jordan River, you cannot start with John. You have to go back long before the first-century stone pools. The air is heavy, smelling of crushed dust, and the smoke of wood fires drifting down from the Temple Mount just a few hundred yards away. You have to step all the way back to the very first sentences of the Hebrew Scriptures, to a time before the earth even had a shape. The biblical text begins in the dark, a formless void, a roaring deep, before there is a garden, before there is light, before there is a single breath of human lungs. There is water. In Genesis chapter 1, the earth is described as tohu wabohu, formless and empty. The Spirit of God hovers over the face of the deep, and that deep, the Tehom in Hebrew, is not a peaceful, glassy lake. It is a churning, violent abyss. To create a habitable world, God does not simply summon dirt out of nowhere. He forces the chaotic waters back. He separates the waters above from the waters below. He carves out a safe pocket of atmosphere, a sanctuary of air where humanity can actually breathe and exist. Dry land is the exception. The water is the default state of chaos. In the ancient Hebrew imagination, the ocean is not a resort. It is a tomb. It is the realm of the sea monster. It is the place of the unknown. It swallows ships. It drowns kings. The human lung is fragile. A body pulled beneath the surface panics. The chest tightens. The heart races. Every second under the water is a countdown to expiration. To go under the water is to be unmade. It is a literal return to the void. He walks down 7 stone steps into cold, standing water until it covers his chest. He holds his breath, bends his knees, and submerges himself completely. You see this pattern hammer across the pages of the Old Testament. Rain falls for 40 days. The deep rises from beneath. The mountains vanish. A world is erased. Generations later, the Red Sea splits. A nation of slaves walks through on dry ground. But the walls of water collapse. Pharaoh's chariots sink like lead. An empire breathes mud and dies. Centuries pass. A prophet flees his calling. The ocean boils in a storm. The sailors hurl him over the edge. The salt water chokes him. The abyss claims him. The water is not a symbol of washing. It is the physical embodiment of death. This is why the flood of Noah is so terrifying. God does not hurl fire from the sky. He simply lets the boundaries fall. He allows the world to return to its original, unformed, submerged state. Decreation. To go down into the water is to step into the grave. To come up from the water is to be resurrected. You leave your old life at the bottom of the sea. You emerge onto dry land as a new creation, taking your first breath of air. This primal fear of the deep embeds itself into the DNA of the Hebrew people. They understood that water was the boundary between life and death. But there is a detail that brings this cosmic terrifying reality out of the ancient oceans and directly into the backyard of every family in Jerusalem. He is not swimming. He is not bathing to wash away the sweat of the Galilean road. He is preparing to cross a boundary. They did not just tell stories about the deep. They built miniature versions of it in their own homes. A woman sits in the shadow of a stone house in ancient Hebron, holding the hand of her dying father. The breath leaves his lungs. The pulse stops beneath her fingers. She reaches out and presses his eyelids closed. In that exact moment, an invisible weight settles onto her skin. She has crossed a boundary. In the Levitical system governing ancient Israel, she has just entered a state called Tumah. English Bibles usually translate this Hebrew word as unclean. And because of that English translation, we instinctively read it as a sin. We assume she has done something wrong. We imagine God is angry with her, that she is spiritually dirty and needs to repent. But she has not sinned. She has simply loved her father. Tumah is not a moral failure. It is the residue of mortality. It is the state of having come into physical contact with the realm of death, touching a corpse, stepping over a hidden grave, losing bodily fluids, enduring a severe skin disease, anything that leaks the vital life force out of a human body, or puts a person in proximity to the end of life. Transfers. This state of Tumah, it is a heavy, invisible shadow. It is the undeniable, physical reminder that human beings break down and return to the dust. This happens hundreds of times a day in ancient Judea. Steps descending into the bedrock, water covering a living body. And this creates a profound geographical problem in ancient Jerusalem. The temple, standing at the center of the city, is the absolute epicenter of Tahara ritual purity. It is the house of God. And the God of Israel is the author of uncorrupted, unending life, where his presence dwells. Death cannot exist. The two realms violently repel each other. You cannot walk into the realm of absolute life, carrying the invisible stench of the grave on your skin. To cross the threshold of the temple, you have to transition back to the land of the living. You have to shed the mortality. And the only way to leave the realm of death is to walk through the waters of the deep. You find a mikveh. You strip off every garment. You climb down the cold stone stairs. You surrender your breath, and you allow the miniature ocean to swallow you whole. The water strips away the shadow of the grave. Because the water is the grave. You die to the death you just touched. And when you break the surface, gasping for air, you are reborn into Tahara. You are clean. You are ready to stand before the author of life. This cycle of descending and ascending, of death and rebirth, governed the rhythm of every faithful household for centuries. You could not walk onto the Temple Mount without passing through one. The bedrock of the city was carved like a honeycomb with these submersion pools. But the prophets did not. A man or woman emerging, shivering, on the other side. These pools are everywhere, carved into the basements of wealthy priests. Just see a mechanism for ritual purity. They saw a theological clue hiding in the Hebrew language itself. And the detail that changes everything revolves around the actual, literal name of the pool. But there is a detail hiding in plain sight. It is buried in the Hebrew language itself. Open the rough parchment of the prophet Jeremiah. Look at chapter 17, verse 13. The prophet is writing in the shadow of a collapsing kingdom. The Babylonians are coming. The city is terrified. And in the middle of the national panic, Jeremiah records a prayer. O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who forsake you will be put to shame. The word your English Bible translates as hope is the Hebrew mikveh. It appears repeatedly in the Old Testament, and its etymology is staggering. The noun mikveh comes from the root verb kava, which means to bind together, like twisting individual fibers to make a strong rope. Over time, that physical idea of binding tension evolved to mean waiting eagerly, anticipating, or hoping, in a literal, architectural sense. A mikveh is a collection of gathered waters, but in the spiritual landscape of Israel, a mikveh is an eager waiting. It is the tension of hope. The two concepts share the exact same word. Jeremiah is playing with this double meaning, dug into the public plazas outside the southern temple gates, chiseled into the desert cliffs of Qumran. They are called Mikvahot. He is literally saying, "O Lord, the Mikveh of Israel." And he proves it by finishing the exact same verse with an aquatic metaphor, warning that those who turn away have forsaken the spring of living water. God himself is the gathered water. God himself is the pool of purification. That single root word changes everything about what happens on those stone steps. If seeing the biblical text open up, like this is shifting how you read these familiar passages, you're exactly who this channel is for. Hit subscribe and drop a thought in the comments. Even one word helps, because every week we go deeper into these ancient texts than you knew was possible. The rabbis who carved those pools out of the Judean bedrock understood Jeremiah's wordplay perfectly. To walk down into the water was to wait on the Lord. It was to bind yourself to him. When the breath left your lungs and the cold water closed over your head, you were acknowledging that you had no power to generate your own purity. You could not wash yourself clean. You had to surrender to the deep. The mikveh is not a mechanism for self-improvement. It is a physical surrender to the only source of life. But there was a catch. Most people assume the story of baptism begins with a wild-eyed prophet named John, standing waist-deep in the muddy currents of the Jordan River. You could not just dig a hole in your basement, fill it with buckets of water dragged from a well, and call it a mikveh. The water inside the pool had to possess a very specific, fiercely guarded quality. A storm breaks over the Judean hills. The first heavy drops of rain hit the parched limestone, kicking up the sharp, metallic smell of wet dust. The water gathers on flat clay rooftops, rushes down deliberate architectural grooves, and channels directly into a dark, stone-carved basin beneath the house. This is not a plumbing mechanism. This is a theological necessity. A human being cannot simply fill a mikveh with buckets. You cannot haul clay jars of water from a local well and pour them into the ritual bath. Water carried by human effort, what the rabbis called mayim she'uvim. Drawn water is fundamentally disqualified. It is stagnant. It has been manipulated by the hands of men. It cannot strip away the shadow of the grave. The water inside the mikveh must be mayim chayim. Living water. Living water is water in motion. It is the rain falling from a bruised sky. It is the spring bubbling up from a fracture in the deep bedrock. It is the river carving its way through a desert canyon. It is wild, untamed, and directly provided by the hand of the Creator. We read the opening pages of the New Testament and think John simply invented a sudden, bizarre ritual of dunking people in water to symbolize spiritual cleanliness. A pool of drawn water is not a resurrection. It is just a bath. The purity is not a human achievement. It is a divine provision. If a family in ancient Jerusalem wanted a valid mikveh, they had to engineer their homes to catch the rain. They built a secondary reserve pool, called an otzer, specifically to hold the wild water that fell from the clouds. Through a small carved channel, this living water would be allowed to touch the ordinary drawn water in the main bathing pool. The rabbis called this kissing. The living water would literally kiss the stagnant water, transferring its wildness, its purity, its life. You could not buy this purity. You could not manufacture it with hard work. You could only position yourself in the path of the rain. God provides the living water. The human being simply surrenders to it. The grave of the mikveh only works because the water inside it is profoundly, undeniably alive. The terror of the deep is swallowed by the vitality of the spring. For generations, this was the visceral, embodied rhythm of Judean life. You touched death. You walked into the living water. And you emerged to stand before the presence of God. But as the centuries passed, the stone pools multiplied. The radical, terrifying reality of stepping into the abyss gradually turned into a polite religious habit.